All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Thursday, January 6th of 2022. Thanks for tuning into the stream here today. It is the opening day of the new PGA Tour season, which is pretty exciting. We've got a 4-game NBA slate on tap as well. Decent-sized hockey slate in the mix here. No football tonight. Already missing my Thursday night football showdowns to talk about, but plenty of DFS to talk about here. Eamon, I'm so sorry. I forgot you told me. I think you told me it was Eamon. Eamon said on time today. We are indeed on time. And let me know, make sure that I'm pronouncing that name, and I promise I'll get it right the next time. I know you already told me how to pronounce that correctly, but we are on time here today. On time most days. Yesterday was a bit of an anomaly. Hate leaving you guys waiting for me there. But we've got a few questions here to talk about today. We'll talk a little bit more about late swapping, knowing when to late swap for certain news, more contest selection stuff here, a couple things. Yeah, so I did get it right. Okay, amen. Cool, perfect. Well, thanks for tuning in. We've got a couple questions about NFL build rules and creating certain lineup constructions. So a few different topics here. I love all of the late swap and contest selection questions because that resonates with the way that I think about NBA DFS in particular. I've mentioned a lot here on stream before that I think those are two of the biggest edges that you can get is selecting contests properly and also making use of late swap. So always great to see when the questions are kind of following that trend. Not to say that there's anything wrong with asking questions about anything else, especially related to NBA. Happy to talk about anything, but those are just such a big part of my process. I always like to talk about that. But anyway, yeah, about a half dozen questions or so in the queue already. Go ahead. If you have questions for me, fire them off into the Office Hours channel in Slack or into the YouTube chat, and we'll get to questions in about the order that they come in as always. Let's go ahead and just get things started. So this is a question from Pin Seeker here about knowing, when to run your final build. So he said, in NBA slates with player game status being announced so close to lock, what source would I be able to get news with enough time to make changes to my lineups? I've noticed that status changes on the step one screen when a player's status was Q and then later get a green check mark. I'm assuming that player is good to go. How much time before lock should I do a final projection update determining if I need to replace a questionable or game time decision player? Yeah, so NBA, first of all, they don't start the games on time, which is really frustrating. I think that adds to some of the difficulty here is that a game that's slated to start at 7:30 Eastern often starts like 7:40 or 7:45 Eastern, and the teams are pretty slow getting their starting lineups and final things out like that. So a couple things. I mean, I'll tell you this. I am typically looking up until the final couple minutes. I would say typically up to about 5 minutes before a game start, I'm still kind of checking to make sure that things are in, that there's no surprises. If news breaks within 5 minutes of a game locking, I will try to make updates as best I can. But if I'm playing on multiple sites and multiple slates and things like that, sometimes I just have to kind of, take a loss there if there's something I'm not going to be able to update everything for. A couple resources that I think are really helpful here. So Shady Advice mentioned the Basketball Monster dashboard. I think this is a huge help. You can see when news is breaking. You can see when players have been confirmed. They've got this nice dashboard here that shows all of the remaining questionable players or doubtful or any players that are on the injury report here on the right-hand side. So for example, if we were heading into lock for tonight, we've got just the one game at lock, right? Yeah, just the one game at lock. So if Noel later comes off the injury report, maybe it's 15 minutes before lock. If no one's listed under this game, it means that there's no players that are left questionable for that game. That can be a good way to kind of know, do we have all the news about this game yet? Is it okay for me to start building lineups? Another thing you can check is actually in the app here, and Pinseeker mentioned this here in his question, but we will mark players with a green check once they have been confirmed in the starting lineup. So if you're seeing a green check here, you'll see 5 green checks per team. typically. And that means that starting lineup has been confirmed. We'll also generally put a green check next to the team name itself if that starting lineup has been confirmed. So, typically a good signal that we have all of the final information, that everything should be good to go, is if you're looking on Basketball Monster here, you don't see any players in the injury report left for that particular game. And also on the app, you see that we've got either the green check next to the team or we've got green checks next to the players. Now, late scratches and things like that can still happen after that. A player can get confirmed in the starting lineup and later get ruled out. But that's typically what my process will look like. So again, heading into lock, I will probably do some initial build 30 minutes to an hour before to make sure that I have relatively up-to-date information in. And then we'll do a final build for the slate once I see that starting lineups for both teams are confirmed, there's no players left on the injury report, and then again do that at 6 o'clock my time, to make sure that all 4 of these teams here have the starting lineups confirmed, no players left on the injury report, then late swap, right? Provided that you need to, provided that something changed. And then for the 8 o'clock game, same deal. Wait till the lineups are confirmed, no more players on the injury report, then swap. So basketball feels a little bit like a part-time job sometimes for DFS, but a lot to keep an eye on. And I mean, if you've been playing these last couple of weeks, right, you can see how it pays off. Last night we got that Trae Young news. I'm sure all of us did, right? Anybody that swapped Gallinari at far too low ownership for what his projection became or what his expectation was. And I know he didn't entirely pay off. I had Timothy Luwawa Cabarro or whatever in a few lineups at like less than 1% ownership. That was far too low for what his projection was after that news broke. All kinds of stuff like that. I know the backup center for the Jazz, Udoka as a Buki or I can't remember his exact name. He was also very low owned. Another player that didn't entirely pay off necessarily, but he was starting and you got him at basically zero ownership. So it's worth it. It's a huge edge, takes a little work. But those are the things I look at. Keep an eye on the dashboard. I think this is just a really clean presentation. And then also combined with the green check marks here. So, but Steve said getting to Herter was hard with him not starting. Yeah. And, sometimes I think one of the things, too, that comes up is like there's two things that happen. When a player gets ruled out, you end up with a lot of players that end up becoming very great value plays, but you also end up in a situation that's much harder to project. So sometimes getting those players right or getting on the right players can be kind of tough. I got a ton of Gallo, and I if I remember correctly with the way that slate ended, I didn't check right at the end of the night, but it seemed like he didn't really ever get there. There were players on the Hawks that did. And sometimes it can be frustrating to be like, I swapped, I did all the right things, I still didn't get the right guy. And that really comes down to like, the inherent murkiness or the difficulty in projecting a team when their star player has gotten ruled out. Even if there is data of what the Hawks play like when Trae Young is out, it's a small sample size. And when you just remove a big important player from an offense, there's just inherent murkiness and difficulty in projecting that situation anyway. But getting to some of those plays just always ends up, generally improving your lineups anyway. So, but a good question there. Let's keep it rolling. JS Junior, I assume JSJR3 asked about winner circle here. We do have a winner circle. So he asked specifically about a winner circle in Slack. We've never really set anything up like that. I know when folks have a good night, they like to post winning screenshots in the whatever channel for their specific sport is. I think that's fine. That's great. I think, it's always pretty exciting to see those winning screenshots after a few folks have had a good night. We do have the winner circle on the site. So if you do have a win here, all right, we're back. Wouldn't be Thursday office hours without a quick little internet blip here. I was saying we do have this winner circle here. If you have a win, top 5 finish of more than $1,000 with the SaberSim logo up as your avatar on the site, tweet us at SaberSim, and we'll get you some goodies. So you'll get a spot up here on this page as well, which is pretty cool. So you can see quite a rich history of winners here. A couple of these pictures not loading. I think that's my internet issue, but. Christopher said, also have to watch news. Jazz center was only a 15-minute limit, so I lowered his projection. Yeah, that's definitely true. I think I probably missed that. I don't think I got to a lot of him in the main slate. I did play a lot in the night slate for him when that news broke. So he was still only 2% owned in the night slate. I felt pretty good about that. I missed that news about the 15-minute limit. I imagine that was probably reflected in the projection, but that's also definitely very sharp because that's something that people will miss. So maybe explains why his actual ownership was so low, as it were. But cool. Let's keep it going here. Another late swap question. This is from K Polo, and he said, for late swap, is there a rule of thumb as the games get less throughout the night? Should we make adjustments to the default slider settings? I think broadly speaking, in general, the answer is probably no. I have experimented with this in the past. Lately, I haven't really been moving things. I think there's a couple situations where it makes sense to. The first situation really is if you have a sense, first of all, if you are well through the night, right? Like tonight's a good example where the final late swap window, we are going to have just one game left, right? 3 games already completed. So I guess there's actually a few situations where I would think about changing the sliders. The first is if you are well through the slate, right? And you can accurately have a sense of whether your lineups are performing well or poorly on the whole, I think it makes sense to make an adjustment to your sliders to kind of account for that. So for example, if your lineups are doing very well, if you have a bit of a sweat as you're heading into the final game, and you probably already have some lower owned, higher variance players in the lineup that have already had success, I think it can make sense to, when you late swap, turn down your ownership fade slider, turn down your variance slider a little bit to get some just better projected plays into your lineups, maybe block with a couple players that are highly owned, and just play the best plays in the rest of the lineup. On the flip side, if your lineups are doing poorly, right, if you're looking at like a lineup, if you're looking at a slate where maybe you're not making any of your entries back, you're heading into the last game of the night, I think you can earn back some of your min cash equity, make back a little bit of your investment on the slate by turning the variance or ownership fader sliders up a little bit. I'm talking just a couple notches maybe in one direction here, and try to get a little bit lower owned plays, get off the chalk in that last game to give you a chance. If you're already looking like you're going to lose, you give yourself a chance of getting back some of that min cash equity by flipping to some of those lower owned plays there in the night game. Another situation where I think it can make sense to turn down the sliders a bit is if there is significant, what I would call like slate breaking news that broke midway through the slate, right? Especially later in the slate. If there is news that breaks that, has created a value option for a particular player that is like one of maybe the top 5 or an elite value option in the slate, you already aren't going to be able to get to the optimal amount of exposure to that particular player because of the salary that you've used in certain lineups or the positions that you've already used in that lineup. So from my perspective, I don't want to limit further how much access I can get to a play that is now a very well projected play that you're probably going to get at low ownership because it's a late swap opportunity because of the variance slider or the ownership fade slider. So, for example, let's take a look at some of these teams playing in the late games here. A lot of guys out for these two teams, but maybe we get some news. Maybe we get some news that like Booker or Paul or somebody's out for the Suns tonight, right? A situation that significantly changes the way that this team is projected, probably opens up some significant values for the Suns. I wouldn't want to limit my ability to get Cameron Payne or Michael Bridges or even maybe somebody like Elfrid Payton into my lineup purely because of where I set my variance slider. So I may turn it down a little bit if really significant news breaks throughout the slate. I think that's really it. I think those are the two situations that would be kind of a flag to turn down your sliders or potentially turn them up, but potentially turn them down. The last little thing I will note here, and this is probably something, if you've ever late swapped, you've probably noticed. When we build your lineups initially, we will be selecting for 20 out of a pool of 500, right? When you late swap, we will be just taking the original 20 lineups and rebuilding them all once. We are planning in a future update to create kind of a late swap pool so that when you late swap, you actually do still get the same kind of pool idea that you get in our current build. But as it stands right now, you do introduce a little bit of natural variance into your build, right? Every single time you late swap, that I wouldn't say is necessarily minus EV, but it does overall increase the natural variance of your lineups each time you build. So if you've ever seen a situation where I built 20 lineups and at lock I had 3 guys at 100%, and after late swapping all those guys came down to 75%, right? That's because each lineup only gets built once. And in the initial build, what was happening is that the top 20 of a big pool of 500 all had 100% of these 3 players, but when each lineup only gets rebuilt one time, they happen to only show up 75 or 80% of the time, right? You're introducing more variance. It is as if you're functionally kind of building with a higher sim variance slider. So I do think there is an argument to be made of dropping the variance slider a tad as the slate goes on, especially if you're close to a particular benchmark of these drop downs already. So to be clear, basically what I'm saying, if I'm playing like a 1,000, there's a lot of contests that are like 1,500 entrants on different sites. So if I was using sliders that was 1,000 to 10,000 to build my initial lineups, one thing I will do, especially, you know, if news has broken already throughout that slate, and maybe if my lineups are doing a little bit better than averages, I will just take the other side of the sliders, which basically have the effect of slightly bringing down the ownership fade slider, slightly bringing down the variance slider, just if only to counteract some of the natural variance you introduce when you late swap in the first place. That's kind of the last one here. I definitely don't think there's anything, I don't think there's 100% a right way to go about doing this, and I think this is a very, very minor change regardless. But I would say those are kind of the 3 things I would think about when you're thinking about your sliders for late swap is, you know, how far into the slate are we, and how well or poorly are my lineups doing on average? Has there been significant news? Do I have a reason to try to avoid some ownership fade, avoid some variance in order to just get extremely well projected players in as many lineups as possible? And then finally, you know, especially if you're on kind of the edge between 2 different slider settings, do I want to bring down my sim variance or ownership fade slider just a tad to account for the natural variance that gets introduced in the late swap build? Those are kind of the 3 things I would look for. So, okay, let's just keep it rolling. I see some questions have come in YouTube chat. We're going to get through the rest of them that are in Slack here. This is from Neil. He said, contest selection question. It seems like Rake isn't a factor in the contest recommendation details. On DraftKings, the low stakes Rake is 16%. Wouldn't it be much better to prioritize higher stakes, single entry or 3 max, such as the red zone or spy, where the Rake is 10 to 12%? The drawback is obviously that you can't put in a ton of lineups and diversify, but it seems like ROI would be a lot higher in the lower raked contests. There's 2 things to think about here. So first of all, I do agree that I think in our contest selection videos that we've put out for the 2021 seasons, I don't think we emphasized looking at Rake enough. I think that's something I want to do a little bit better next time. There's 2 things that happen here, though, is that when you jump up in stakes, you do get a little bit of a lower Rake. But there's really 2 drawbacks here. One is that you are entering probably a higher tier of contests where the quality of the lineups is going to be a lot higher, right? Especially if you're playing under $3 contests. I think people undervalue how much dead money is just in those contests to begin with. The real Rake of contests at $3 and under on both DraftKings and FanDuel is lower than the calculated Rake because of how much, just literally how many lineups there are that are dead on arrival in those contests. Secondly is that, and you mentioned it here, Neil, but I think it's a pretty big factor, is that you increase your variance significantly by just playing a single lineup or 3 lineups or just a handful of lineups at higher stakes to get a little bit of lower Rake than you would by spreading out and playing a lot of different lineups at lower stakes and eating some of that Rake that's at those lower stakes. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, I want to go tackle lower Rakes contests. Maybe you want to just play smaller fields in general and saying that you're going to play a little bit on medium or higher stakes single entries instead. But if you were to do that, I would also combine that with scaling back your bankroll, right? Probably playing quite a bit less bankroll investment on a given slate because you've increased your variance so much, right? If you're playing 3 lineups a slate, it's going to take you roughly 33 different slates before you even have an expectation of a single top 1% lineup. To put that in perspective, for a football season, that's almost 2 consecutive seasons. Whereas when you spread out, play a lot more lineups at lower stakes, you have a much greater chance on any given slate of having that top 1% outcome that we're looking for. So There are successful single game and 3-max players. I understand why it is appealing to certain people that have that strategy. Rake is important to look at. One of the reasons I preach Yahoo as a good site to play on. Yahoo has its own issues with effective entrants and smaller size contests overall where your EV might be lower, right? But one of the reasons I like Yahoo is because they allow you to play. You can get a lot of lineups down at the $1 or the quarter or the 50-cent entry fee area and also only pay 10 to 12% rake, which is great. But rake is important. It's something that you should look at. But I think for our contest selection recommendations, I think the additional level of skill that you're playing against in those contests, combined with the fact that you're increasing your variance so highly, is why we don't recommend people do that. Also, I mean, SaberSim in a lot of ways is really set up for multi-entry. It's not exclusively like a MME tool. You can certainly use it for single entry and be successful. But I think one of the big advantages is that with SaberSim, you can build 1,500 good lineups quickly and very quickly select the best 20 or 150 out of that and get an edge on the field playing against other people that have a much harder path to building 150 successful lineups, right? In a single entry contest, this is something else I think people don't often talk about enough or think about enough. A lot of people that have at least been around DFS for some time and are familiar with some basic concepts can even hand build themselves a pretty decent lineup overall, right? If you're familiar with the concepts of correlation, you understand ownership, maybe you have some basic set of projections to work with, you could probably hand build yourself a decent lineup. You may be able to hand build yourself 3 or 5. And you certainly probably could program a traditional optimizer to build you 3 or 5 decent lineups with equity, with win equity in a contest. When you start asking those same people to build 20 or 150, right? You are asking first of all, you've basically removed the ability of them to be able to hand build that many effective lineups. And you're also asking them to do a lot more with the traditional optimizers that don't handle GPPs very well in the first place, right? And I think there's an edge there, especially at low stakes. When we're talking about things like the mini-max, right? You're asking a field of players that are going to frankly struggle heavily with building 150 successful lineups in that contest. So that's kind of why our contest selection mix is what it is. I do want to emphasize a little bit more looking at things like rake and payout structure in the future and maybe for the starts of next season. But that's why they are what they are. And I would probably still stand that for the average user, I think you are better served if you're playing, these red zones and spies. These are $50 to $100 single entries. If you're playing $100 to $200 in an NFL main slate, I think you could probably do a lot better playing 150 unique lineups, playing 250 unique lineups potentially, depending on what contest you're entering, rather than playing 4 and just entering these higher stakes single entries. So, but a good question for sure there. Okay, cool. Let's see. Let's get this one here. Okay. B Crimson says, in NFL, is there a way to tell the builder to only allow one running back / wide receiver or running back, wide receiver, tight end from a team unless stacked with the QB? Even with correlation on high, I still get players from the same team that are negatively correlated. For example, getting Kmet and Allen Robinson or Everett and Metcalf with lineups without their QB. I've tried to set a rule in the advanced stacking, but they still show up in lineups without the QB. I understand even with the negative correlation, their projection or value can be good enough. It just makes sense that it makes sense to have them in the lineup. It's just a personal preference for me. Sorry for the long question. Yeah, the unfortunate answer here is that there's not an easy way to do this for now. The reason that the stacking rule doesn't work, I'll explain this first because I think it can just be kind of useful in understanding the way that the stacking rule's logic is set up, why that isn't working, because I think intuitively you would think it should, right? Oh, not that kind of rule. An advanced stacking rule that says no more less than or equal to 1 of running back or wide receiver from a tight end. The reason why this rule doesn't work in the way you think it does is because the builder believes that this rule is basically honored as long as there is any one player that is not paired with a teammate in your lineup, right? So it doesn't, as long as, so even if you got Metcalf and Everett together, as long as you just had like a lone AJ Brown in the lineup with no other Titans or something like that, then the rule would theoretically be satisfied, and that's why it doesn't work. There's not really an easy way to avoid this other than that at the moment, other than cherry picking the individual lineups out and unchecking them in step 3. And I know that's a little bit frustrating. The silver lining here is that a functionality to do this in some capacity is on the way, in the form of kind of a player group type thing where you can create like 2 players and say, don't max 1 of these 2 players. There will probably also be some iterations on this in the future. I think I would cautiously say that I would hope before the start of next NFL season that you have a lot more control in this way. So I know it's a bit frustrating, a bit tedious that you have to do this in a manual way, or just live with some certain lineup constructions that you don't necessarily like as much in the meantime. But we have heard this request often, and it's something that's on our radar. I would say in the meantime, one other thing that you can kind of try to do is build a stacking rule or a set of stacking rules that kind of creates a baseline construction that you're looking for. So for example, say, let's say that you want a QB plus anywhere from a 1 to 3 stack in every single lineup, and a run back of maybe just a wide receiver or tight end, right? And you set this as a baseline. I think if you've set that rule and that rule's there, I think one other thing you can consider doing is also then increasing your correlation slider a bit. And I would do this. I would not blindly do this with 15 minutes left before lock. I would experiment with this first and see if you're getting lineups that you like. But by turning the correlation slider up a little bit, you'll increase the value of that. So in some ways, you'll tell the builder, like, you've got a guy like Cooper Kupp, right? And you're not playing Stafford, right? Be less willing to use Odell Beckham in that lineup than you otherwise would have, right? Because you're increasing the weight that this negative correlation has, right? Now, keep in mind, there are correlations that I think at times do not match with intuition. Players sometimes are correlated differently than you might expect. You can see that often with running backs here. I have seen before that running backs for the same team often sometimes actually share a slight positive correlation, right? This kind of thing can happen, where I think the easiest way to kind of intuitively think about this is if a significant running back game script has emerged in that particular sim, right? That both running backs can benefit, right? A blowout type situation is most commonly where that happens, or vice versa. If a team is getting blown out and the team abandons the run completely, both running backs suffer equally. It creates this kind of soft positive correlation effect. It's not true of every running back in the field, but this can kind of happen. But I think that's another way you can do this is the reason you set the baseline rule is so that when you crank correlation up, you don't start getting QB plus 4 and QB plus 5 stacks, right? You set the kind of rule that I want the core QB stack to be this, but value correlation more heavily throughout the rest of the lineup. And I would say run test builds and experiment on this and see what you have to do to get there. I think as you're also increasing sim variance, right? So the sliders in some way can kind of be thought of working together in a relative way. So for example, as sim variance increases, if correlation stays the same, the impact of correlation on a relative level is actually going down. Because what's happening here is like, let's say at sim variance 7, you're getting a bucket of sims, and within that bucket of sims, there's a game where Justin Jefferson scores 35 points, right? Maybe the Vikings offense succeeds on the whole, right? Well, at sim variance 7, Justin Jefferson's projection is going to be combined with other players that are with other games that are also in that bucket. It's going to bring his projection down necessarily. It's going to bring all players closer to their mean. And it might, at that point, let me think about what I'm trying to say. It might use Kirk Cousins in the lineup, right? The correlation is high enough. Other players in the pool are close enough, and it makes sense to use him. But as this goes up, right, we have this situation where maybe now at sim variance 10, since you're using a single game sim, you've got a ceiling game from Justin Jefferson. You've got a ceiling game from maybe even KJ Osborne or something like that. And Kirk Cousins has a 95th percentile game, but in some other game, Aaron Rodgers isn't playing. In some other game on the slate, this is such a weird slate. Maybe Tom Brady has thrown for 5 touchdowns, right? So you end up with this lineup that's a Brady and Mike Evans stack, but it has Justin Jefferson and KJ Osborne both also in there because they had ceiling games in their own individual sims. The effect of correlation is diminished because the sim variance is so high. So you can, in some ways, kind of counteract that by pumping your correlation back up a little bit and just experimenting with lineups at this setting. So, summary here, right? Always like to summarize these, especially when I've been talking for a little while. Not a very easy way to do it at the moment in the app beyond unchecking lineups that have certain combinations of players together in step 3. We are working on a functionality, and we will continue to iterate on that functionality to allow some, I would say, basic player groups to avoid this kind of thing in the future. In the meantime, I think one of the things that you can experiment with is setting a stack rule to kind of control the overall lineup construction of your lineups and then cranking the correlation slider up from there to value these slight negative correlations a little bit more. So, okay, a handful more questions here in Slack, and then we'll get to the YouTube chat questions here. This is from KB. And he said, question about late swap. If I'm playing 150 max GPP with 10,000 to 50,000 entrants, default sliders, run a late swap, and say chalky players at initial lock are in my lineups, will late swap take those players out for less chalky players depending on how the lineups are doing? If I want to keep the chalky players in, should I adjust sliders in late swap? Hopefully this makes sense. Thanks. They can be. It's not a guarantee that they will be, right? So what basically happens when you late swap is we will lock all of the players in the lineup whose games have already started. We'll lock those players in, and then we'll remove all of the players in the pool whose games have already started that are not in that lineup. And then in the remaining spots available in the lineup, clear everyone out and then just rebuild a new lineup. So that means you could potentially have a chalky player get removed. In a sport like NBA, when the chalky players are often also very well projected and ownership fade is a little bit lower by default, I think it's less likely that that happens. But anyone whose games hasn't started in a lineup is subject to potentially be swapped out when you do the late swap. In terms of adjusting sliders, I answered when or why I would think about adjusting sliders overall at the start of the show. So I'd go back and watch that particular segment. I think probably the lesson here, the overall lesson is I would say, as best as you can, do not fall in love with or get attached to your lineups as they are showing at lock, right? Treat your lineups as my lineups are the players that are playing now only. Like, the more you can do that, the better. Like when you are building lineups for your NBA slate tonight, right? Think about your exposures and your lineups and your constructions and things like that really as only your Celtics and Knicks at lock. Then that will avoid a situation where you anchor to lineups that were built at lock and kind of fall in love with them and then refuse the added value of new information, right? If you end up swapping a lineup out that for whatever reason, swaps out Jordan Poole in your late swap build, even though he's the chalkiest player on the slate and one of the top 3 overall values on the slate, that lineup is still viable and in fact maybe is better than what you had in there before. But if you had gotten attached to that particular construction, you might unnecessarily avoid something like that. So all of this to say, your lineups can certainly change when late swapping. If you late swap even when no news has changed or no news is broken, your lineups are going to change. There is some merit in specific situations to turn down your sliders. I would check back to the start of the stream and listen a little bit about that if you want to hear more about that. But I think the main point here is that you should be understanding and accepting of the fact that your lineups are going to change when you are late swapping, and encourage that because that means you're getting the opportunity to take advantage of new information. So rough them up. Good kind of feature request here. I'll read this out loud real quick. He said, would it be beneficial to have a column to show a projection difference after a sim has been completed so we can see the biggest differences from previous sims? If so, is this possible to add at some point? That's something we've talked about. I think it would be useful. One thing I'm doing at the moment is every time I late swap, I just have gotten in the habit of clicking this download button and saving the projections. And then I'll name that file and say, this is what the projections look like at 6 or 5:30, right? This isn't a good example of it tonight as well, but it can be useful sometimes to see, a I always say err on the side of late swapping, but sometimes it's useful if a sim runs. You can see what specific game sim ran, and you can go look at the projections for that particular team and then see and say, what changed? How much changed? Do I want to swap? Did anything change at all? Right? That can be kind of useful. But we do want to add kind of like a change log. That's something we've talked about as a way of seeing this is what just changed in the most recent sim. And that might not even be something that's like directly on the app. I think we've talked about like kind of just like a button here where you could update it, open it, and it would just say like biggest pluses, plus minuses in the most recent sim that you could see. So definitely something we've talked about there before. But all right. Question from Sean. He said, research build for NFL is a look at an optimal build, but I think cash build has a higher projected score. I've always thought about cash builds being optimal, so just curious. What makes a research build with a sim variance of 10 more optimal than the cash build of all the sliders at 0? What's basically going to happen is a cash build run with all sliders at 0 is basically going to show you the optimal lineups that you can make when all players in the lineup score their average projection, right? The most likely outcome more often than not for the particular player. And the reason that's good for cash is because that's what we're going for, right? We want a lineup that has more or less a 50% chance of finishing in the top half. So to do that, we build the highest projected lineups on average. You get the best bang for your buck from a salary standpoint. Average performances don't win anyone GPPs. The reason why I run research builds at 0-0-10 is because what happens here is we basically get to simulate out the slate 1,500 times. We basically get to look at 15 different combinations of the way each game on the slate could play out, and then look at what the top overall lineups are. The lineups that you get when you run a 0-0-10 build are the actual scoring optimal lineups for what players scored in that set of game sims. So then when you look and you can see Jordan Poole is showing up in the optimal lineup in 30% of simulations for a 1,500 simulation sample, that speaks to his overall upside, right? Not his average expectation. That says something about how likely he is to show up in the winning lineup for a GPP, not how likely he is to show up for essentially in the winning lineup for a cash game, right? Because we are essentially trying to find that ceiling outcome. So that's why I run those at 0-0-10. That's why they're useful. I think when you run builds on cash, if you were to run a big set of builds on cash, I've done that before. One of the things I think that can be useful for is a little bit of a way to determine what the most common lineup constructions are going to be, right? What's going to be the chalkiest? Not necessarily, another way, it's an alternative maybe to looking at just pure ownership projections of seeing what are the best projected plays. What's the field going to do? But when you're looking for your own, when you're trying to determine the chance of a player being in the winning lineup, I think it's a little bit more successful to look at the extreme situations, the single game simulations instead. So let me know if that makes sense. But another good question there for sure. Looks like we're already getting some NBA news. That's probably why that Warriors value popped up for me all of a sudden. It seemed like that popped up midstream. Draymond and Steph out. So just another NBA slate here. Brad said, I know you can sort lineups in your build by percentiles, but is there a way to build lineups in percentiles in SaberSim? There used to be. We actually took it out. It was interacting strangely and poorly with sim variants. So one thing to remember, right? Always important to remember. Let's talk about this real quick. When you build lineups with SaberSim, provided that your sim variant slider is non-zero, that is at least a non-zero value, we're not actually using this number, right? What we are doing is we are randomly bucketing game simulations of each game on the slate and using what that player scores in that particular set of sims, right? So this number doesn't actually get used. What happens then is on step 3, we will take the lineups that you've built, and when you set a percentile, we are shifting that player's range of outcomes so that their mean becomes that particular ceiling. So if you set it to the 85th percentile, we're saying, okay, this player's mean is now their 85th percentile outcome, which ultimately has the effect of basically ignoring the lower range of that player's outcomes, right? So you are saying you are essentially squeezing out a tiny bit more upside at the expense of average or floor performance for a particular player. The reason we took it out is because when you do that before the build, right, you end up creating a ceiling kind of tail of outcomes for a player that are more or less not possible, and then build on that, right? If we change De'Anthony Melton's mean projection to his 95th percentile ceiling, right, we are going to shift basically this entire curve so that this biggest column here is somewhere probably around 45. And it implies that there are outcomes for De'Anthony Melton where he scores 70 plus points. And we just felt that the lineups that you were getting when doing it that way were worse, frankly. Whereas you don't get that effect when the percentiles are set post-build. So that is kind of why they are the way they are. You are getting a better alternative to using a ceiling projection or a percentile projection when you initially build your lineups purely based on sim variance alone. So that's why that is kind of set up the way it is. And that is all the questions I have in my queue for right now. Ripped through those pretty quickly here today. Let me see. I'll do a quick poke around and look and see if there's any other questions that I've seen in chat. It looks like there's some interesting conversations going on in NBA here. Don't see anything else. Any other questions immediately to answer? Does anybody else watching have any other questions for me? If you do, go ahead, get them posted into YouTube chat or the Office Hours channel in Slack, and I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, we'll maybe call it a day a little bit early today and go sweat those golf lineups maybe. But good stream overall today. Lots of late swap questions, always great. A couple questions about lineup construction. Obviously the percentiles question here. Yeah, Steve makes a good point. You can also just change a player's projections to a different percentile and rebuild. You certainly can. In fact, it's actually pretty easy to do that because when you download the projections, there will be a column for the percentiles. So you could just copy that, put it in the projection column and re-upload. I would exercise some caution there though, right? It is not true that De'Anthony Melton's mean projection is his 85th percentile, right? That is not true. That is wrong. And when you enter that pre-build, you dramatically impact the way that the lineups themselves end up being built. Whereas in step 3, when we put the percentile there, you just resort lineups that are already built. Steve says I do this individually, not for all players. I think that's fine. The effect of that is basically the same that you would get from just purely boosting a player's projection to begin with. If you are doing that to get leverage on particular players or something like that, I think that's fine. That's like basically the same effect of making an adjustment to a player's projection anyway. But doing it for a lot of players or every player in the pool is probably just going to degrade your lineups rather than improve them. So Christopher says, when you late swap and say you have a 70 to 100 min max on your core plays for the night slate, late swap still has to honor those while swapping through the night. They do, as long as those exposures are either here or in the entry editor themselves, right? So if you're late swapping repeatedly throughout the night, I think you can see that if you late swap multiple times, the exposures here may go away. They can go away on subsequent builds. So I would say, especially if you have a core of players that you really want in your lineups, I would just double check on those guys and make sure that those exposures have persisted. But the entry editor will listen to exposures that are listed here. So just keep an eye out for those throughout the night. The reason that these reset in the first place, at least as far as I understand it, is so that you don't end up in a situation where you had an exposure for a player that you don't want anymore because news has broken, right? Like if something significant changes throughout the slate and you've got exposures for a bunch of players and you've got 5 minutes to make an adjustment, right? You don't want your 50% max exposure to or min exposure to Jordan Poole to continuing to be having an effect on your lineups once Devin Booker surprise got ruled out in this game. And now you also want to be making sure that you're getting some Cameron Payne or Alfred Payton or something like that. So that's why those reset. So I would say for your core, just check throughout the night as you're late swapping and make sure that those exposures are still set the way you want them to be. But they will be honored when you're late swapping. So good question. What else we got? Anything else? Any other questions for me here today? I think we'll go ahead and probably leave it there. If you have a question, right? If you're anything like me, as soon as I hop off the stream, maybe you're watching, you'd be like, oh, I meant to ask about that. No worries. We will be right back here again tomorrow. Same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern. So enjoy the first golf event of the year. Enjoy this little 4-game NBA slate. Enjoy the NHL DFS slate tonight if you're playing a little hockey. And until then, I will see everybody here tomorrow. So good luck. Thanks. See you guys.